A Dialectic on Total War by Richard M. Weaver. The preceding chapter has dealt with the liability of forms to become oppressive, but manifestly this is the negative aspect of the subject. Forms are the result of discipline, as the epigraph also notes, and their role in structuring and sustaining what is created is too omnipresent to require special comment. The next chapter will discuss a situation of the greatest urgency in which the repudiation of forms, not the forming of new forms, has results which are profoundly unethical and which threaten to destroy the foundations of civilization. Form, when it is responsible, may embody ethical restraint, which is to be distinguished from ethical dictation in the realm of the aesthetic and from aesthetic aggrandizement in the realm of the ethical. Of the many things which cause us to feel that spirit indispensable to civilization has been weakened, none should arouse deeper alarm than total war. I make no reference here to the enormous physical destruction which the war of unlimited objectives leaves in its wake, terrible as that is. To think in these terms would be to treat it as a merely physical problem, and our means of coping with merely physical problems are increasing all the time. It is easier than ever before to clear up rubble and erect new structures. Western Germany, but a few years after the tremendous damage wreaked upon her by punitive bombing, was a phenomenon, a veritable phoenix risen from the ashes. The rebuilding of devastated Japan is almost equally impressive and astonishing. Today, what man can destroy in this manner, he can recreate with great speed. If all we had to think about was how to build new houses and factories where old ones had been obliterated, the emergence of total war as a symptom of our times would not be so frightening. The clay and the stone quarries are there, and it is always possible to rebuild, and sometimes it is a good thing to have to rebuild, provided that the opportunity and the will exist. But what of the opportunity and the will? As is true of all important developments, the consciousness was prepared for coming of total war some while before it appeared as an actual fact. The theoretical considerations always precede and, in a figurative way of speaking, grade the land for what is to follow. In this case, the theoretical preparation was made easier by a general attack upon the idea of discrimination. For the past several centuries, there has been a growing tendency to collapse hierarchy and, in consequence, to deny, ignore, or abolish proper distinctions among human beings. These distinctions, or discriminations, have been of many kinds, answering to differences in age, in sex, in education, in occupation, in way of life, in degree of commitment to transcendental goals, etc. In periods of high culture, there is interest in diversity as well as in sameness, and society uses the standards of many qualities to measure and identify, not merely the single standard of quantity to weigh. This fact expresses a belief that there are qualities, faculties, and vocations that distinguish human beings in ways that have to be respected. Institutions of all kinds have taken these into account. Actually, there are very few things that are the same for everybody, since the giving of the same to different people results in a mechanical and tyrannical repression of special qualities. Society is an articulated system, and articulation requires differences of station and performance. It was in keeping with this vision of things that even the institution of war, up to recent times, had to make appropriate discriminations. There were those who were qualified to fight and those who were not. There were those who were liable to its dangers and losses, and those who were exempt. There were things which men engaged in fighting a war might do, and things they were forbidden to do. But the theoretical undermining of all discrimination cut the ground out from under discrimination in this area too. The coalescence of the people of a country into one mass began under the influence of certain scientific concepts and furthered under the influence of certain sociological and economic dogmas, destroyed the outlook which had given sanction to these discriminations. Those who had insisted that certain groups by their nature or by their vocation had a right to be spared the sufferings of war now had nothing to appeal to. The difference on which the appeals had formerly been based were dismissed as illusory or as undemocratic. Naturally, the closer society is moved toward a monolithic mass, the harder it becomes to plead for any kind of exception. One was considered to be like one, and one like all, and this equalitarianism was followed by many corollaries asserting the right and liability to equal treatment. If men are no different from animals, females no different from males, the young no different from the old, philosophers no different from fools, it is easy to proceed on to say that non-combatants are no different from combatants. They are all now fused into one element, which is treated as a unit for the purposes of war, by the country as well as by the enemy. To say that this change has been brought about by a failure to make distinctions which had become traditional is to state a truth that needs to be recognized, but it is only a halfway stage of the inquiry. Behind this failure itself, there must lie some grievous and more pervasive cause, capable of affecting other attitudes. I am confident that we must locate it in the denial that things have independent natures, and in the uniform attempt of science, since the 17th century, to explain everything by something lower than itself. This principle is, in effect, a teleology in reverse. Instead of trying to explain things by what they are ultimately aiming at or endeavoring to become, one explains them by pointing out the more primitive or less complex stratum from which they have emerged and on which they are now considered to depend for their being. We are familiar with the general processes in which the mental is reduced to the psychological to the the physiological to the chemical, and the chemical to the physical. Things no longer have natures or wholeness in themselves with upward tendencies. They are but configurations of quantities, subject to change by the laws of physical dynamics. As one writer has said, this establishes a new unity of the universe, but of a different complexion from the Greek one. The aristocracy of form is replaced by the democracy of matter. Given this as the cosmic view, the democracy of war making and the democracy of matter are seen to derive from a common ground. All explanation has to start from the bottom, and in fact never leaves it. War is now not a matter of changing minds, but an engineering problem, and an engineer must deal with the basic physical forces. Distinctions among human beings stand above these in the old scale, but in the new scale they stand beneath, because the primary being is assigned to the physical. There is no reason, therefore, why a war measure which is perfected as to means should defer to things that have an inferior standing. Qualities and conditions that differentiate men traditionally now cease to have force. Indeed, the means build up a kind of self-momentum. The more one does, the more one can do, and the frailer become the essences which used to interpose between the world and man's complete manipulation of it. Then, a question like, "Why did you bomb an open city?" becomes an irrational question. The ontological order with reference to which one could say, "You should not bomb an open city," has passed away. Open is now only a factor in the engineering equation. Thus, the world on which ethical discriminations were based is dissolved into a complex of lower order functions. Now, let us turn to the historical evidences of this truth. The French Revolution marks the period when the impulse to end discrimination and to integrate everything first began to make itself definitely felt. From the beginning of the age of chivalry until this date, the Western world had generally recognized a code of war. Adherence to it, of course, was not complete, and some shocking violations can be pointed out, but opinion was against them, and the concept of total war was not part of the inculcated ethos. The American Revolution affords a good example of the mentality that lasted down to, and in some of its phases, after the French Revolution. The historian Arthur Eckrich has described how the Americans, despite the state of hostilities, were able to carry on their normal peacetime interests and pursuits. His account follows. This was not true only of regions unaffected by the war, but also applied to civilians caught up between the lines of the embattled armies. In an age when total war was still off in the future, non combatants were able to enjoy certain rights and immunities. American scientists, for example, continued to correspond with their colleagues in England. Thus, a Harvard scholar, in a letter to the Secretary of the Royal Society in London, maintained that political disputes should not prevent communication in matters of mere science. Nor did he see how anyone could be injured by such intercourse. Benjamin Franklin and other American patriots retained the goodwill of old acquaintances in England, and to Franklin, Sir Joseph Banks, the distinguished naturalist, affirmed, "I respect you as a philosopher and solicit the continuance of your friendship." Moreover, American students, despite the war, continued to go abroad to study medicine in Scotland or painting in London under the aegis of the American expatriate Benjamin West. Footnote: Arthur Eckrich, The Decline of American Liberalism, New York, 1955. Page 35. End of footnote. The Napoleonic Wars following the French Revolution moved a step away from this by bringing in the democratic conscript army, but they preserved the distinction between combatant and non-combatant. Civilians retained their freedom of movement. British and French scientists continued their correspondence. The armies marched along paths prescribed for them, fought for victory rather than for annihilation, and expected society to go on with its function. When the 18-year upheaval was over, the central figure in it, though overthrown, was neither hanged nor shot. He was transported to an island where he could live out his years in comfort, if not in happiness. When he escaped and repeated his offense, he was transported to a more remote island. There was never any thought of trying to prove something by killing him. A distinction was preserved between an enemy on the field of battle and an enemy captured. During the Crimean War, Russia continued to pay interest on its debt to its enemy, Britain. War was one thing, the honoring of financial obligations another. The American Civil War, coming a decade later, marked a decisive turn in the direction of total war. This can be seen in a striking way because in that war both concepts were present. The old chivalric concept of the war of limited objectives, conducted against soldiers only, and the new one of unlimited warfare involving campaigns against civilians and the total destruction of the resources of the enemy. The Federal commander George B. McClellan and the Confederate General Robert E. Lee belonged to the old school. Both conducted the type of war which is designed to overthrow the opposing army and decide the issue on the field of battle. It was not part of their policy to turn the war against civilians and non-military objectives. Clifford Doughty speaks accurately when he writes of McClellan. He fought to suppress the armed forces of dissident fellow countrymen, whom it was his duty and his desire to return to a common union. He did not consider it his duty, and it was certainly not his desire, to make war on those civilians among his countrymen who differed from him on the interpretation of the Constitution. He fought without hate, without cruelty, as if it were indeed a rebellion to suppress and not an alien people to conquer and despoil. Footnote: Clifford Doughty, The Land They Fought For, New York, 1955, page 164. End of footnote. It was quite possibly for this reason that Lincoln, and especially the radical leaders of Congress, became impatient with his slowness, which was the price of his respect for forms, and removed him from command after the Battle of Antietam. The character of the war thereafter changed drastically, and in the last 2 years, the Federal generals William T. Sherman and Philip H. Sheridan carried on a systematic warfare of destruction in Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas, with the object of involving the entire population. The statement of the former that he would bring every Southern woman to the wash tub, and of the latter that he had devastated the Shenandoah Valley so that even a crow flying over it would have to carry his provisions, sounded the end of the age of chivalry. For his part in this, General Sherman has been termed, by an admiring biographer, a fighting prophet who saw beyond the old concept of war to the new order, in which no one and nothing would be spared. That Sherman and Sheridan were prophets is not mere speculation, for we have evidence that their innovations were given attention by the German General Staff. General Sheridan went to Europe as an observer in the Franco-Prussian War. At a banquet given by the German Chancellor in 1870, he remarked that he favored treating civilians with the utmost rigor, since he believed that the people must be left nothing but their eyes to weep with over the war. The auditor of this remark confessed himself struck by its brutality, but added that it might warrant consideration. Footnote. See Moritz Busch, Bismarck, Some Secret Pages of His History, 2 volumes, New York, 1898, Volume 1, page 128. End of footnote. America thus may have helped to teach Europe the democratizing of warfare, just as she has taught it a number of other leveling concepts. Whether the Germans actually put this ideal into practice in the First World War, as the widely publicized Belgian atrocities might attest, I do not know, but the advance toward totalism in this war certainly appears in the sweeping nature of the conscription practiced by all belligerents, and in the way in which every phase of life, economic, financial, social, and cultural, was drawn into the struggle and made ancillary to the war. To an unprecedented degree, the idea was promoted that the nation should become as one, with no thought but to kill and destroy. Those of mature age may recall the hysteria whipped up in this country by President Woodrow Wilson, which went even to the point of banning the playing of German music. The Second World War went immeasurably further and reduced the word non-combatant almost to meaninglessness. Distinctions of sex and age and vocation vanished away. The Western genius for technology had invented a weapon of destruction which took no account of terrain or of distance. The bombing plane, which could fly practically anywhere and drop its lethal cargo on any target that military science or the spirit of vengeance might suggest. These obliteration bombings carried on by both sides in the Second World War put an end to all discrimination. Neither status nor location offered any immunity from destruction, and that often of a horrible kind. Mass killing did in fact rob the cradle and the grave. Our nation was treated to the spectacle of young boys, fresh out of Kansas and Texas, turning non-military Dresden into a Holocaust which is said to have taken tens of thousands of lives, pulverizing ancient shrines like Monte Cassino and Nuremberg, and bringing atomic annihilation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are items of the evidence that the war of unlimited objectives has swallowed up all discrimination, comparison, humanity, and, we would have to add, enlightened self-interest. Such things are so inimical to the foundations on which civilization is built that they cast into doubt the very possibility of recovery. It is more than disturbing to think that the restraints which had been formed through religion and humanitarian liberalism proved too weak to stay the tide anywhere. We are compelled to recall Winston Churchill, a descendant of the Duke of Marlborough, and in many ways a fit spokesman for Britain's nobility, saying that no extreme of violence would be considered too great for victory. Then there is the equally dismaying spectacle of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the reputedly great liberal and humanitarian, smiling blandly and waving the cigarette holder, while his agents showered unimaginable destruction upon European and Japanese civilians. The object of this reflection, however, is not to place blame for any particular atrocity, but to ask whether civilization has given itself a moral hurt in going so far beyond bounds that were previously respected. Footnote. At this point, I shall anticipate an objection which might be made by referring to the history of ancient Greece. No one thinks of denying that the Greeks created one of the most brilliant cultures and civilizations in history, but anyone reading Thucydides will look in vain for much exhibition of chivalry in the treatment of prisoners and non-combatants, many of the former being slain outright, and many of the latter sold into slavery or exiled. In reply to this objection, I would make a series of points. In the first place, the Greeks were a pre-Christian civilization, and I have given in the chapter The Social Role of Rhetoric reasons for believing that Christianity made a culture and ethical contribution surpassing even the high water mark of the Greeks. In the second place, the Greeks did acknowledge certain responsibilities towards their deities, such as the right of asylum in temples, which exerted some restraint upon their acts of violence, even in war. These provided, on occasion, a kind of sanction embracing both sides. The restraints were not always respected, but they were there, and they were rather frequently invoked. In third place, there is evidence that Greek thought was tending in the direction I have been defending. For example, Thucydides, in commenting on the Revolution and Corcyra, has this to say, Book 3, Chapter 84, quote, "Indeed, men too often take upon themselves, in the persecution of their revenge, to set the example of doing away with those general laws to which all alike can look for salvation in adversity, instead of allowing them to subsist against the day of danger when their aid may be required." End quote. Finally, one needs to consider the fact, generally admitted by the historians, that the Peloponnesian War marked the beginning of the decline of Greek civilization. End of footnote. It is said that some kinds of animals become infected with a type of madness, which leads finally to their extinction as a species. Is this the kind of epitaph that will have to be written for modern man if there is anyone left to write epitaphs? I foresee the objection that this whole problem is being put into false terms by someone who simply does not understand war. It will be said that once you are committed to war, the one and only thing that matters is victory. Your declaration of war is a declaration that another government, or another people, to infer from the present trend, has no right to exist, and that any means whatever may be used to destroy them. The sole object is to win and impose your will. All other considerations are impediments or irrelevancies. In times of war, military necessity becomes the absolute sanction. This principle is so terrifying in theory, and is becoming so ruinous in practice, that we should be impelled to a re-examination of the reason for warfare. The conjoining of reason and warfare, of course, seems absurd to many people, but the phrase itself is not as senseless as at first it might appear. War used to be described in the language of diplomacy as the ultima ratio, the final resort that a nation fell back on when all other means of settlement had failed. It implied that you had a logical reason on your side, which in the existing situation had to be given the support of force. Moreover, the history of civilized warfare does in fact reflect this rationale of war. The rationale assumes that there is an arbiter of the destiny of nations. The arbiter has often been referred to as God, But even where the idea of supernatural deity was absent, there was some concept of overarching reason which could be depended upon to decide in favor of one party or the other. When a nation had done its best, when it had exerted its maximum lawful strength, it accepted the arbitrament of the sword, whether that was given for it or against it. If against it, the defeated party had to admit that the other side had the better reason and had to accept a settlement that accorded with that reason. This is the only way that warfare can be assimilated into the framework of rational thinking. So conceived, war is used as a means of reinstituting reason or of bringing people to their senses. Unless war can be conceived in this way, it must be regarded as a completely irrational eruption, and every settlement created by war in the past ought to be canceled and worked out again in a different way. But the very fact that war is described as the ultima ratio implies that war is subordinate to reason, not reason to war. Hence, what happens when one party decides that this, like other hierarchies, is old fashioned, and that the way to conduct war is to carry it in extremis? The party then does what nations have done in recent times. It adopts the non discriminatory policy and endeavors to make war as complete and as wholesale as energy and ingenuity can manage. Let us try a brief dialectic upon this concept of war. 1. The conventional ways of breaking the enemy's will to resist, which is the object of war, are not meeting with success. Therefore, it is concluded that the scope of the war will have to be increased. New methods will have to be brought in, and the objects of attack will have to be widened. 2. The enemy soon perceives this, and seeing that the old methods of warfare are being abandoned, he decides that he must not merely follow, but must go the opponent one better. If the war is to be waged with what the Germans call Schrecklichkeit, or horribleness, one feels compelled to try to stay ahead. 3. The inaugurator of these tactics sees this as a new perversity on the part of the enemy and goes still further. Having started the all-out policy, he is committed to it and cannot pull back without self-condemnation. 4. The enemy, having been forced, as he thinks, to go 2 steps in this direction, finds it easier to take a third. So he adds to the Schrecklichkeit with renewed determination to resist at all costs. 5. And so further, the increase in barbarity goes on until everything is dissolved in blind violence, and there is no desire left but to survive oneself and enjoy the pleasure of destroying and punishing. What started out under the auspices of reason now becomes appetite, a universal wolf which must make perforce a universal prey, and last eat up itself. This is the theoretical and, as it may happen, the actual end of the policy of total war. What has occurred in the course of the transformation? The most obvious fact is that the war has lost its character. By this I mean that it no longer survives as an institution, which can be described in rational terms, but becomes pure and ultimate unreason. We cannot fit this kind of war into any of the categories that we are used in making statements about civilization. To represent this in a figure, war has become a fire so hot that no container will hold it. It will melt anything, and the walls of no furnace are able to keep it within bounds of any utility. What looked at first like a useful shortcut becomes fatal because it destroys the balance of forces without which things cannot be shaped to man's ends. Only a flaw in thinking, or indeed a failure of the consciousness, could allow the series of steps towards total war to commence. Reliance upon pure and unqualified force cannot, in the nature of things, achieve a human goal, since in the human realm pure act is destructive. What are the premises which have launched modern man on the course which, though plausible, must end in this kind of self-defeat? There seem to be 2 of these. one theoretical and the other experiential. The theoretical argument holds that you never go to war unless you are absolutely certain that you are right, and that if you are absolutely certain you are right, there is nothing you should leave undone to carry your point. Restraint would be a sign of lack of conviction, and considerateness would be laxity. No excuse can arise for not waging the war by any and all means. If you are absolutely right, the enemy has no ground for objecting to anything you do while he is resisting you. The answer to this, as previously intimated, is that it contradicts the philosophy of war. If war is to have a rationale, it must be an appeal to arbitrament, and arbitrament is a decision. The nation going to war is betting that it is right, and is appealing to those forces which, in a morally conceived universe, give strength to the right. With belief in the right, as God gives us to see the right, is the stock formula of any statesman taking his country into war. The critical factor here is the reference to something outside the war itself. It is not that the war maker makes his right, it is that right warrants the war and enables his side to carry it to a victorious conclusion. The advocate of total war, on the other hand, does not regard victory as something that is up for decision through approved methods of arbitrament, but as something the warring party has from the beginning, or rather would have except for the inexcusable resistance of a totally depraved opponent. So war ceases to be a settlement in the sense of a contest to be decided by the strength and skill of the two sides, and turns into a kind of punitive operation, with each one trying to see how much it can make the other suffer in all its parts for refusing to accept the unilateral judgment. Thus, total war implies the view that the opponent is altogether evil, not the tragic view of the opponent as a character good in some respects, but gone wrong in others, who needs to be brought to his senses. In this way, total war really undermines the idea of war, and this fact has led some people to favor it. I shall deal with their dilemma in a later passage. The exponential argument for total war is usually expressed very simply. It saves lives. I have seen Sherman's campaign in Georgia and the Carolinas defended on the ground that it brought the war to an end sooner, consequently saving lives. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki has been excused in the same way. This argument, however, has a fatal internal contradiction. Under the rationale of war, the main object of a nation going to war cannot be the saving of lives. If the saving of lives were the primary consideration, there need never be any war in the first place. A nation threatened by war could surrender to the enemy at once, preventing the loss of even a single life. The enemy would, in all probability, allow the people of that nation to go on living, even if it demanded unconditional surrender and proposed to make the people of that nation slaves. The truth is that any nation going to war tells itself that there are things dearer than life, and that it proposes to defend these even at the expense of lives. The people are reminded of this in numberless ways, and every young man is instilled with the thought that he must be willing, if called upon, to make the supreme sacrifice. In war, the saving of lives is a consideration secondary to the aims of the war. This is not to say that there is no economy of means in war. It does, however, say that in war, the economizing of lives is not the first aim, since in embarking upon the war, that nation declares that the war aims are the supreme goal for which lives will be spent, if necessary. The self-contradiction of total war is that it destroys the very things for which one is supposed to be sacrificing. The total belligerent finds at the end that he has the formal triumph, but that he has lost not only the lives necessary to win it, but also the objectives for which it was waged. In other words, he has lost the thing that the lives were being expended to preserve. Although this view of war may seem to some quixotic, it is required by reason. A nation stooping to wage war of the total description abandons those discriminations and restraints which civilization slowly and painfully creates through patient example and exhortation. These creations are fragile under the best conditions. It is difficult to bring them into being, easy to shatter them, and they are not readily put back together again. Means and end are related so intimately that means unavoidably have an influence upon ends. After total war, a belligerent is on an immensely lower plane than that on which it began. Means have been saved, but ends have been changed or forgotten. Conditions in the United States after the Civil War and in Western Europe after the First World War will provide plenty of evidence for anyone who desires historical confirmation of this fact. As for the Second World War, it has ended in a situation in which we will make perpetual war in order to have a distant perpetual peace. The means have taken over complete control of the ends. We are left with neither evidence nor expectation that total war will serve as a deterrent to the making of war any more than the barbarous punishments once inflicted on criminals prevented others from taking up crime. Men are always disposed to meet absolute threats with absolute defiances. When the war settles down, just as in other circumstances, to a struggle as to which shall prevail, the only difference being greater sacrifice and suffering. Viewed in another light, this is part of the present world's general exaltation of means over ends. The changes produced by technology offer strong temptation to a well-known human weakness, which is to feel that if you can do a thing, you should do it. This has reached a point with us where people actually feel a loyalty towards means, which leaves them indifferent to ends. The more secular society grows, the more dominant this attitude is likely to become. In the absence of a teleology, which can never be attained except by transcending empirical history, men are thrown back upon seeing how wonderful they can make means in themselves. The mere effort that teleological speculation requires induces many to limit their gaze to means. Furthermore, the temptation to use a means once devised appears strongly to the child in all of us. If it works well, it flatters our sense of ingeniousness. This is the outlook of the mechanic, and perhaps not even of the very good mechanic. It can never become a statesman who is charged with accommodating the institution of war to the necessities of his people and in the larger purview to the civilization of which they are a part. Here it is necessary to say something to those who object to regarding war as an institution at all, and who maintain that the only admissible thought about a war is its total abolition. The position is assumed by many out of a praiseworthy idealism. But when all matters are taken into consideration, how informed and realistic is it? We notice first of all that these people are themselves totalists, or we might say, total utopians. The only thing they will consent to is a total extinction of war, and some seem to think that the emergence of total war is a step, even though a horrendous and costly one, in that direction. These people are a type of reformers, however, who think that human nature and history can be laid aside. War is a phenomenon ancient beyond reckoning, which has involved man's being in numberless ways. Granted that it is absurd and even criminal to say that war is the health of the state, still, it is also absurd and it may be unsuspectably dangerous to say that war is totally foreign to the nature of man. A popular musical review of some years ago contained the refrain, "You have to be taught to hate." This is so far from being true that we can assert, on the contrary, that hating is one of the most instinctive things man does. It is rather the case that you have to be taught not to hate, or at least to control your hatred. In the same way, it is false to claim that war is repugnant to man naturally, and that men are always tricked into it by the artifices of society or dragooned into it by outside pressure. War appeals to the human spirit in too many ways, and too subtly, for us to proceed on any such generalization. As an indication of how innate the feeling for war is with us, we may recall that religions show no compunction about using metaphors of war. Consider the way in which the followers of the pacifist Christian religion sing, "Onward, Christian soldiers, a mighty fortress is our God," and "The Son of God goes forth to war." Moreover, it is palpably untrue to assert of any large group that all of its members hate war. All of them may hate it in their moments of most detached and abstract reflection, but how often will these moments occur? A small fraction may hate it sincerely and undeviatingly, but a far larger fraction will be torn between love and hate, between fascination with it as a game and a challenge, and revulsion from its consequences. Any political leader preparing his country for war is able to play on this ambivalence. War is wrong, but just shift the rhetorical framework a little bit and it becomes right, and it holds out tantalizing opportunities. This is true even of reputedly great idealists like Lincoln, Wilson, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. In addition to these, there is a significant group which actually loves war. The mystic soldier is the name that Kenneth Burke applies to this type in a passage of deep insight. They are the individuals who actually find a mystic imperative in war. They are thrilled by the panoply of the parade, and they derive some intense, if obscure, satisfaction from the spectacle of slaughter. You cannot lock them up as criminals, for in peacetime they are often quite sober and law-abiding individuals. But, unleashed by the emergence of conflict, they are the dogs of war. Nor does it seem that they are abnormal in the sense of degenerates. They appear only to have an unusual development of a strain which is in most men. Every people, including our own, produces the type. General Sherman was certainly one of them. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, beneath his Presbyterian piety, was another. General George Patton of the Second World War was a good example. You do not get at the nature of such men through the political pressures of a particular hour, since it is not the proclaimed war aims which make them want to fight. It is their mystical response to the idea of war itself. When William James wrote his well-known essay on the moral equivalent of war 2 generations ago, he showed an awareness of some of these perplexities. He recognized the deep-lying appeal of the military virtues to human psychology, of which he was, of course, a profound student. He said rightly that we will never be able to disarm the militarists by offering glowing pictures of security and ease, like those proposed by socialists and pacifists. These pictures have no attraction for one side, even though it is the darker side of our nature. They have no power to deter these mystic soldiers, who in the course of events often become the leaders, transforming and energizing the masses. The kind of pacifism that rests upon materialistic socialism ignores important areas of the human psyche. But James was himself in error in supposing that human warfare can be converted into a warfare against nature, that we could conscript armies of workers or fighters against nature, give them the same drill, something of the same hardship, and come out with the same result as in war. I fail to see this would affect the kind of purgation he expected. In warfare, we bear against other human beings what Yeats has called an intellectual hatred. It is a peculiarly deep, bitter, and implacable kind of hatred, growing from the feeling that other rational beings have done us wrong. It is nourished by all the powerful emotions: fear of what other rational beings could do to us, pride, honor, dread of humiliation, and thoughts of sadistic pleasure. Is there really any substitute which could drain off this passion, or, at the most, drain off more than the top of it? In view of all these circumstances, it is delusive to think that war can be abolished totally by some kind of international fiat. Any such notion disregards the ontological basis of war. We are up against something which cannot be dealt with without a clear acknowledgement of the facts which produce it. History indicates that we may be faced with one of that class of things which are going to occupy a certain amount of the ontological order, regardless of how we treat them. If we deny them vertical space, so to speak, they are going to find horizontal space. We may imagine that we are getting rid of them when we change their shape or their extent in one direction, but later we find that we have only made a redistribution. There are certain things which we have to come to terms with simply because an attempt at extermination not only fails of its object, but at the same time deranges the general settlement. Try to suppress them totally, and they only shift their operations and find new modes of existence, some of them more harmful than the previous ones. Therefore, we must ask in all realism whether war is not one of those phenomena which, in the nature of its case, cannot be just stamped out. The very attempt to do so shows an ignorance of the kind of force one is proceeding against, which ignorance may give it new opportunities. In recent decades, as just noted, there has been a tremendous sentiment in favor of the total abolition of war, but the general result does not indicate that it has been at all effective, and this suggests that it has not been informed. It has been widespread and it has been vocal, but as far as actual achievement goes, it has been like stabbing the wind. If we take count of the wars that have occurred since the beginning of the 20th century, we get no impression that war is a moribund phenomenon. Indeed, it is nearer the fact to say that wars are now more frequent, and the prophecy of Nietzsche that the 20th century would be the classic century of war is well on the way to fulfillment. Let us imagine some citizen born in Dresden around 1890 and educated for a life of culture and refinement in a stable world, as many there must have been. If he is still alive, which is fairly doubtful in view of all that has happened, how must the world look to him? What he must have gone through between 1914 and 1945 is almost inconceivable. A citizen of fallen Rome circa 500 AD could hardly have witnessed more of violence, turmoil, and suffering. We might remember, too, that this illustration involves one of the most highly developed civilizations in history. In science, in scholarship, and in music, no nation of the world had attained more than Imperial Germany. Furthermore, it was internally, perhaps, the most law-abiding of all nations. These attainments did not save it from terrible destruction in wars, whether these wars were thrust upon it from the outside or started by it out of feelings of insecurity or ambition. This achievement of a high state of civilization alone did not decrease the incidence of war. Some evil force had not been successfully provided against. Thus, the modern war against war has not succeeded, and the failure should suggest a radical revision of approach. The one hope that is left lies in some overriding restraint, some form of limitation upon the war-making impulse itself in its very operation. History affords at least one arresting example of success in controlling war, not by outlawing it entirely, but by canalizing it. This was the institution of chivalry, which flourished from the early into the late Middle Ages, and from which most of our surviving code of war derives. Although chivalry is today the butt of jokes, it was in fact a magnificent formal development. If, to the utilitarian mind, it appears quixotic, let us remember that quixotism is sometimes the outward aspect worn by precious ideals. Chivalry was in reality an assertion of the brotherhood of man, which makes the abstract, windy, and demagogic apostrophes of the present day to brotherhood look empty. For what chivalry taught is that even when men fight, They must fight as brothers. It was a guarantee of equal and inalienable rights in situations where the passions of men are most likely to deny rights. This, incidentally, is where so much modern theorizing is weak. Its solutions might be valid if man were a passionless creature interested only in satisfying a few simple wants, although even this admission of wants contradicts the idea that he is a passionless creature. But see him in all his complexity and ambivalence in a situation where history and rhetoric are playing upon him and the theories collapse. The people of the age of chivalry seem to have felt, as some no doubt feel today, that it is somehow laid upon man to fight. It is his nature, or his destiny, or his original sin. Fighting could never be abolished, leaving not a trace behind, but they felt that something could be done about the how. The Code of Chivalry declared that even if you feel that you have to fight your brother man, this does not mean that you place him outside the pale of humanity, nor does it mean that you may step outside yourself. Even in warfare, and whether you get the best or the worst of it, you conduct yourself in such a way that civilization can go on. The real, the absolute prohibition is against shattering the mold of civilization, which includes both you and your foe. Thus, under chivalry, there existed a spiritual, universal dominion, which enclosed the activity of fighting as the furnace walls enclose the fire. It may be countered that it is against all idea of the spiritual for men to fight under any circumstances. But again, we have to deal not with fictitious simplicities, but with the complex and contradictory nature of man as revealed in his historical record. What this particular spiritual motive did was to refine and elevate the practice of war, compelling it to abide by a kind of morality. It may be that in the long and bitter experience of humanity, this is the best that can be hoped for. It will have to be recognized that the worst thing of all is to give up your status as a self controlled human being, because once that is given up, you are by no means certain of retrieving it. Such is the thought that seems to have lain behind the formal restrictions of chivalry. Moreover, there is an analogy from civil life, which proves that formalism is not always quixotism. Let us suppose that in some community a dreadful crime has been committed, say rape accompanied by murder, and that the criminal has been caught. The facts are generally known. There can be no doubt about who is guilty, and the crime deserves capital punishment. The entire community is aroused, and a large public gathering, which we may interpret mob if we like, surrounds the jailhouse. Why should not this public gathering, if it represents a majority of the electorate, take the prisoner out at once and give him his due? Execution is going to be his end anyhow, and this action would be quicker, saving both time and money. It would undoubtedly carry out the will of the people, and it would afford the added advantage of democratic participation in judgment and execution of the laws. But instead of that, there will be observed the tedious forms of law: indictment, trial, judgment, sentence, await before the execution, and finally the man is put to death by some legally delegated person. Why go through all this rigmarole to get rid of an infamous criminal? It is the settled opinion of most of our Western world that if society permits the former kind of action to take place, it does harm to itself. There is no substantial difference about the end to be sought, but one means is regarded as anarchical and destructive, and the other as legal and preservative of the mind and structure of society. The forms are expensive, but they are worth more than they cost. Then there is a further consideration, which stays the hand of direct action. A civilized nation of the Western tradition never says that a criminal, however terrible his crime and however palpable his guilt, has no rights whatever. The very majesty of the law is dependent upon securing to the accused certain rights. There are at the minimum protection against the kind of mass violence just described, and trial according to law. The kind of totalism which denies all rights has been revived in the present age, with its general discrediting of principles and its supposition that the new means entitle us to discard ancient fundamentals of ethics and of law. No more disturbing system of this new mentality has been seen than the demand for unconditional surrender, recently introduced into warfare. A conception of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the most secular and superficial of all American presidents, it strikes deep at those restraints which in the past kept warfare within bounds. Whether this idea was born of vindictiveness, of which Roosevelt seems to have had an ample portion, or whether it was merely a product of his debonair thoughtlessness, is difficult to say. It was a brilliant idea for those who live by public opinion, for it made the kind of display that gets into the headlines and stays there. Yet not only is it blasphemous, it also strikes at the comity of peoples. The brotherhood of peoples, like the brotherhood of men under chivalry, implies some basic sanctions which must not be shattered by the accident of war. The ignoring of these sanctions out of opportunism is a weakening of the fabric itself. The truth of this was illustrated at our expense when, less than 10 years after the war was over, we were courting these same unconditionally surrendered nations in the hope of making them allies. At what point after unconditional surrender did they become eligible as allies, or even as parties with whom any kind of negotiation could be conducted? Or was all this dependent upon the will of the conqueror, who could say according to his whim, "Now you are without the pale," and "Now you are within"? This is, of course, pure arbitrariness, which cannot be the foundation for any civilized order. Some may indeed feel that the case against total war is valid up to the recent past, but that it collapses in the face of atomic warfare. The invention of superbombs and of intercontinental guided missiles has advanced warfare so near the absolute stage of indiscrimination that even those observances that carried over into our century have been made completely impossible, and nothing seems in prospect but mass brutality. The kind of reason that used to underlie the exertion of armed force now fades out as that force is no longer able to respect any distinctions. War, instead of proving some idea, can now only prove that one side has beaten the other to the unleashing of total extermination. Hopeful consideration must be given here to the thought that there is in humanity something unpredictable and immeasurable that resists the idea of being subjugated by a weapon, however ingenious and powerful. What the unprecedented weapon has always done is to concretize feeling against it on a vast scale, so that its technical superiority is nullified by a great human protest, which brings into the ranks of the opponents large numbers who would not otherwise be there. History furnishes several examples of nations which thought themselves unstoppable because of a new or secret weapon, but who found that the weapon only multiplied the forces against them, especially the important psychological one. The spirit of man has thus far always prevailed over mere technological means. The question today, however, is whether we have passed a critical point so that the effects of the superweapon can no longer be measured in degrees. It approaches the absolute, and once it has been exercised, there is simply nothing left in which opposition can reside. Humanity does not get a chance to reform its ranks and express its condemnation. Whether this is so is probably known only to the foremost scientists, or perhaps it is one of the unhatched potentialities of the laboratory. But if it is true that atomic weapons are now nearly absolute, the question is whether the spirit of man is capable of forming an attitude powerful enough to prohibit absolutely their use, which would be a step back toward recovering the chivalric concept of limited violence. Our hope seems to lie in the fact that we do know exhaustively the resources of the human spirit. We do know that in a period of universal chaos, it was able to create the institution of chivalry, and through it give law to destructive impulses. We do know that more than once in the past, the human outlook has undergone even miraculous seeming changes, so that the ideals of one era completely confound the expectations of the preceding one. There have been times when men have turned away from all they most sought in a previous age, and have sought what they had held in contempt. Massive as it is, our present infatuation may be susceptible to such a change. The freedom of the spirit is such that, under the guidance of a dialectic and the impulse of a powerful rhetoric, men might turn irrevocably against what now obsesses them, and decide that the salvation of happiness requires taking a different course. It seems fantastic, but perhaps not more fantastic than things which have happened. Only a change of this magnitude seems enough to stop the present onrush toward destruction. Only a great conversion, in the sense of turning around, may save us from unprecedented disaster. With any other conclusion, we have to admit that man has lost control of his destiny. With any other event, we may have to witness the truth of Poe's line: "The play is the tragedy, man